going to start discussion of environmental control. We're going to look at frost protection today and how frost protection works. And this is kind of a bizarre idea because you would think, well, gosh, if I froze water, I'd make things colder. But actually, just the opposite occurs. Whenever we apply water in the liquid state and let it freeze, at that instant that it freezes, it releases heat, and it's called the heat of fusion. So you see that there in your notes. It's called the heat of fusion. At the instant that water goes from a liquid to a solid, it releases energy into the atmosphere. So it heats the air. When it converts from water to ice, it heats the air. And every pound of water that freezes releases about 144 BTUs. Now we could get into the numbers game and find out exactly how much heat loss we get. And when we get into the irrigation design class, we do that. So we actually go through and calculate total BTU gain in an area. Now it has a, Terry?
Would you repeat that? Pounds per?
Oh yeah. Every pound of water that freezes releases approximately 144 BTUs at the moment it converts from water to ice. And that, where does the heat go? Goes into the air. Or into the limb or bud if it's freezing right on the plant itself. Some will go into the atmosphere, some will go into and go onto the branch that it's freezing on. Now there's a couple of there's another thing that really is dependent on this process, and that is the dew point. The dew point has an effect on frost protection as well. The lower the dew point, the more critical the situation gets. And when the dew point is very low, that means that there's very little moisture in the air. And that becomes more critical timing for the farmer. And we're talking about early spring, protecting for frost on the blooms or on the small fruit that's already being, the buds, the blooms, or the small fruit that's already been set on the fruit tree or the vine. Okay? And every stage of growth and every type of crop has different critical temperature stages. Like when an apple is just in the bud, it might be 24 degrees becomes the critical temperature. And if it drops below 24 degrees, it'll kill the bud early in the spring. Once it gets to the late bud, that critical temperature might move up to 26 or 27 degrees. When it gets to the bloom, that temperature might move up to 30 degrees. When it sets the small fruit and you just got a little nubbin of an apple on there, the critical temperature might be 32 degrees. Now, of course, we're getting later into the season as we go through this process, so that may have started in March, and by the time we get into April sometime, we got those little tiny apples set on there. But throughout that time frame, we have a critical time in the growth of that particular fruit. And any given night that it drops below the critical temperature, we could lose that particular potential fruit. It'll freeze off. Now we can use this added heat of freezing water to heat up the air within the orchard or vineyard and keep it above the critical temperature. That's the goal that we have when we use irrigation for frost protection. Now it works when we have nights that are called radiant cooling nights. And in the Northwest, we're pretty lucky, and that's one of the reasons why we grow a lot of fruit here, is that when we have cold nights, it's simply because the sky clears and the heat that has been trapped on the surface of the earth due to the sun radiating heat throughout the day it starts going back up into the atmosphere at night, into the cold, dark, never land. And so on clear nights, it can get pretty chilly out in the spring. And that's called radiation, and we're losing heat due to radiation. It's radiating up into the atmosphere. It's trying to balance the temperature all the way to the stars. And so it's sucking heat off of this Earth's surface to warm the air up higher in the sky.
So that's radiant cooling.
So that's radiant cooling. What we do down here on the surface of the Earth is just try to raise the temperature down on the surface to counter that radiant loss that's going up into the sky. And so if we can put enough heat back during the nighttime to counter what's radiating out, we can keep this thing from dropping too cold and freezing the crop.